Okay, so the Gemara that we learned yesterday, we had mentioned that we mentioned this argument, the Rambam and the Ramban, regarding if prayer is biblical or rabbinic. And we gave a number of answers to explain the Rambam, because the Gemara seems to say pretty clearly that prayer is rabbinic. How could the Rambam go against that and say it's biblical? So that we discussed yesterday. And then the next Gemara that we learned a little fast, so I want to go over it a little better. And that is that the Gemara mentions, how do we know Birchas HaMazon, grace after meals? How do you know you have to recite grace after meals? So the Gemara gave a verse. It says, you should eat, you'll be satisfied, and you will bless. And that's how we know biblically you need to recite grace after meals. And then the Gemara asks, how do you know that biblically you need to recite a blessing before the Torah? And as I mentioned, the blessing before the Torah, there are two ways of understanding this Gemara. One way of understanding it is it's the blessing before getting an aliyah, before you get called up to the Torah. At least the first person who gets called up, before they read the Torah in public, the first person, when he recites the blessing on the Torah, one way of understanding it is that that is biblical. He would be biblically obligated to recite a bracha on the Torah. It doesn't apply to all the people that get called up. It's the first person who gets called up. The other people who get called up, there's a rabbinic obligation for them to recite blessings when they get called up. But the first person, before you read the Torah in public, you would need a blessing, a biblical blessing, which is the bracha that we recite before we get called up to the Torah. That blessing would be biblically obligated. That's one way of understanding our Gemara. Now, there's a very strong question on that understanding of our Gemara. And that question is based on the fact that why do we read the Torah on Shabbos, on Mondays, on Thursdays? Where do we find such an obligation to read the Torah? So it's a rabbinic obligation. Now, how could the Torah tell you need to recite a bracha before you read the Torah if the whole Torah reading is only rabbinic? How could the Torah tell you? The Torah's got to tell you you need to recite a bracha before you read the Torah. What do you mean? What do you mean before I read the Torah? There's no such thing. Reading from a Torah scroll in public. There's no. Where does it say to read from the Torah scroll? It's a rabbinic obligation. So I have to say a bracha, biblical obligation to recite a bracha when the whole reading of the Torah is only rabbinic?
Yes. If you do read the Torah, you have to make a bracha. There's no biblical obligation to read the Torah, but if you're going to open that scroll and read from it, you have to make a bracha.
Okay, so this is a very good answer. Thank you, Isaac. That's correct. That's 100% correct. That the Torah is not telling you that you would be obligated in reading from the Torah. But if you do read publicly from a Torah scroll, you would be obligated biblically to recite a bracha. That's one way of understanding this Gemara. There is an interesting law that would come out of that way of understanding the Gemara. And it's something that I've never seen anyone concerned about or aware of, but it seems like it might be something. If you learn the Gemara that way, what would come out from that is that if you go to a shul and the shul has a custom in the beginning of the month of Nisan to recite the paragraph about the Nesiim from a Sefer Torah. Some people have a custom. I've gone to shuls, generally in the Hasidic world. There are Hasidic shuls that they actually read
every day.
They read from a Torah scroll, the Nasi. So after the davening is over, they pull out a Torah scroll and they read the portion of the leader of the tribe of each of the 12 tribes that brought a sacrifice on the month of Nisan. This is the month that Pesach falls in. So each day in that, the inauguration of the tabernacle took place then. So for the first 12 days after that inauguration, each tribe brought a sacrifice. And there's some have a custom to read that from a Torah scroll. They pull out the Torah scroll and they read that. And it's not a, no one recites a bracha when they do it. They just pull it out and they read it. Now, according to this understanding of our Gemara, what would come out is you're not allowed to do that because you would be obligated in reciting an aliyah bracha. If you read the Torah in public, you would need to say a bracha beforehand. And so I know I was in one of these shuls and they needed someone to read it for them. And I remember that they asked me, could you help us, do us a favor and read it? And of course I helped them and I read it. But now that I learned this Gemara with this understanding, it would seem that it might be an issue. That, in other words, because the custom is that they don't, they're just doing that as a customary reading. Now, in Lubavitch, we read the Nasi every day of Nisan, the first 12, 13 days of Nisan, but we don't recite it from a Torah scroll. We don't use a Torah scroll, so there's not an issue. But it's when you get called up to the Torah, or when you are reading from a Torah scroll in public, that would be a issue to read, that you would be obligated, possibly, according to this Gemara, you'd possibly be obligated to recite a bracha, Asher Bachar Banu. Now, I'm not sure what the halacha is. I don't know if it's brought down. I have to look up, I guess, if this is a halacha brought down in Shulchan Aruch and how it's brought down. But it would seem that would be an out.
The minyan, when they first opened the shul, the minyan, the men, the 12 men, aren't they kind of making the before the people
blessings
for the Torah reading?
Right. So whenever, not just when you go to shul, everyone when you daven, everyone recites the morning blessings. You have the blessing on the Torah. That's good, and you're supposed to recite the blessings in the morning. Before you do anything,
right.
You recite blessings, and some of those blessings are on the Torah. 3 of the blessings are on the Torah. That's personal. Then when you do something in public, like for example, you get called up to the Torah. So that's another time then you recite another blessing on the Torah.
So you still
when they call
have
you up when they read the Torah scroll in public. So the person who gets called up to the Torah recites a blessing on the Torah.
Okay.
So that's what we're referring to here. In addition to your own personal blessing that you recited in the morning.
In addition to the minyan, the minyan does their own thing, and that's done, and then
does an additional blessing when a person gets called up to the Torah, he recites an additional blessing on the Torah. Yes.
I see. Okay.
So anyway, that's one way of learning the Gemara. The other way of learning this Gemara is that we're talking about the morning blessings, which when a person recites them, you recite a bracha. It's a biblical obligation to recite the bracha in the morning. So you're either gonna a conclusion from this Gemara is either gonna be that the morning recital of the blessings on the Torah are biblical, or the being called up to the Torah and the reciting of those blessings are biblical. But somehow you're gonna cut one of these are biblical. However you learn the Gemara, it's biblical. There is a big problem, because the Rambam, again here, he says that the blessings on the Torah are rabbinic. So the earlier Gemara said prayer is rabbinic. The Rambam says biblical. And here the Gemara says blessing on the Torah is biblical, and the Rambam says not rabbinic. And of course, the Rambam is not arguing on the Rambam doesn't argue on the Gemara. So the commentaries try to figure out. I shouldn't say that he says it's rabbinic, but he doesn't count it in his calculation of mitzvahs. And so the commentaries try to figure out why doesn't he count the mitzvah of the bracha on the Torah as one of the mitzvahs? It's not he doesn't count it in his calculation of all the 613 mitzvahs. He doesn't calculate it as one of the 613 mitzvahs. So again, I take that back. I don't know if he says it's rabbinic or biblical, but he doesn't count it in his 613 mitzvahs. So all the commentaries try to figure out, what do you mean? Here the Gemara says it's a biblical obligation. It should be one of the 613 mitzvahs, but the Rambam doesn't count it. So that's a discussion. And most of the commentaries, it's like, it's a very hard question. There is a confusing answer, but I'm not gonna go into it. It's brought in the Slach. One of the commentaries does give an answer. In any event, that was the beginning part of this statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. Rabbi Yehuda said the name of Rav about these two blessings that are biblical. And then Rabbi Yochanan came along and said that you can make this kal v'chomer, this a priori argument. You could make one for each of these laws. You could make one to learn that you would be biblically obligated in reciting a bracha before the meal, and you could use this argument to prove that you'd be obligated in reciting a after blessing on the Torah. So we've got both. He wants to prove both from using such an argument to prove both of these. And what he's basically saying is, if one of them is obligated in a bracha beforehand, the other isn't, so then that would prove that it's in a certain sense better. And if the other one's obligated in a blessing afterwards, and this one isn't, it proves that that one is better. So each one has some type of a proof that they're better. And if they, if the other one obligates the other blessing, how much more so the better one for sure should be obligated in the other blessing. So he goes back and forth trying to prove that we would be obligated in reciting a bracha before a meal biblically, and we'd be obligated in reciting an after blessing on the Torah biblically. That was what he wanted to prove. And
Rabbi,
Gemara proves it. The Gemara disproves that idea, that argument. Yes, Susan.
okay, in the Tanya, I was reading yesterday that on page 446, it says God reckons a good intention as an actual deed. Okay,
So,
that if you have a good intention, that Hashem recognizes that as it's a done deal.
Well, I wouldn't say exactly a done deal.
That's what's in the Tanya is what I'm saying. That's what
it's based on a Gemara, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu considers it. Hashem considers it like an action, but that doesn't mean that you are exempt.
I didn't say that. Just that
it doesn't mean you've necessarily fulfilled everything you could. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the appropriate thing, but it does say that Hashem will consider it that you've fulfilled it. So if you're trying to connect that with our Mishnah, and you're mentioning that he did whatever he could by thinking the Shema, not saying it, and that should be like he said it because the Tanya says that it's considered like he said it. So that is a good question, and the answer is no. It's Hashem might consider it. It will give you reward, fine, but you still didn't do the mitzvah. Hashem will give you reward possibly, but that you still didn't do the mitzvah. And of course, we want you to have as many mitzvahs as you can. You want to fulfill as much as you can. So you might be getting the reward. Hashem will count it. That's regarding the reward. You won't get punished. however you explain that and whatever, all the different explanations. But the point is that that's not the ideal. That's not and it's not necessarily fulfilling the obligation. Okay, so getting back to what we were talking about, and we were in the middle of this discussion about proving about these other blessings that they should also be biblical. And the Gemara said, no, we can prove you're wrong, Rabbi Yochanan. And the Gemara has two proofs. The Gemara has two reasons why it's not a good argument. Rabbi Yochanan's argument is not a good argument. What are the two reasons why it's not a good argument? The first one is pretty simple. It's basically says that each of these mitzvahs are unique, and therefore you can't learn something else from it. And one case was that's unique is a meal. A meal is unique. It's a person is getting physical benefit. There is a big discussion here among the later commentaries about getting enjoyment from studying Torah. Is that appropriate or is it not? Are you using the Torah for your own personal enjoyment? Is that sort of like degrading the Torah? Or is this the exact reason for learning Torah, that a person should enjoy every moment of it and be excited and have an enjoyment? Again, the Gemara here says that when you eat a meal, you're neheneh, you're benefiting. So there is discussion among the commentaries, among the later commentaries, if that is, if that would imply, like when you study Torah, maybe it's not called sincere, maybe it's not called lishma, for Hashem's sake. If you're enjoying it too much, it's more and the other commentaries argue and say, absolutely not. This is the exact purpose of learning Torah, is that you can attach yourself to the Torah. You should enjoy every moment of it. But there is a little hint from the Gemara. So it is discussed. So the Gemara mentions that a meal is neheneh, you're benefiting. And which means physical benefiting. In Torah, the Gemara says, is unique because it's chaye olam, it's everlasting life. And because of that, you wouldn't be able to learn another case from it, because this is a special law that the Torah says you recite a bracha beforehand. It wouldn't be able to prove that something that doesn't have chaye olam, everlasting life, would be obligated biblically. And that was one proof. Then we had a proof from the Mishnah, and the Mishnah seems to prove that something about the hamotzi bracha, is it rabbinic or is it biblical? Could any of you tell me a proof from the Mishnah if the hamotzi blessing is biblical or rabbinic? Take a look at the Mishnah on page 20b and see if you can prove to me from something that it says in that Mishnah that would tell me that the blessing hamotzi is either rabbinic or biblical. Reuven.
I would say the hamotzi is the one that precedes it, and our Mishnah, right? Our Mishnah is talking about the brachas that are after eating, that those are required.
Okay, but does it say anything about the preceding bracha in the Mishnah? Is there anything about the hamotzi bracha in the Mishnah? And would that say if it's biblical or rabbinic?
Well, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it says that
no, not Rabbi Yehuda. I want the main view of the Mishnah.
It says you can't recite the brachas that precede the meal.
Yeah. Okay. Does that prove it's
So
rabbinic or biblical?
It sounds like it's It's directly from the Torah.
So your vote is that hamotzi is biblical.
Correct.
Okay. I don't understand the proof. What's your proof?
The Balkari can't recite the brachas that precede the meal.
Okay. Now,
If there
does
were-
he recite the Shema? Does he recite the grace after meals? About Kerry?
Oh, he thinks them.
He thinks them. He thinks both the Shema and the grace after meals. And does he think the Hamotzi bracha?
Rabbi.
I don't know. Let's see.
Okay, someone else want to tell us?
It says he is,
Moshe?
he is-
Okay, I don't have it in front of me.
Oh, so
You
don't
know,
answer this question.
No, but no,
Then
Olam
it's
Haba.
not
Does
for
it have
you.
to do with Olam Haba? Does it have to do with
It-
Olam Haba?
No,
the,
nothing to do with Olam Haba, no. Okay.
it says he is
yes.
to recite.
We're
in
learning.
his heart-
There's reference.
He is to recite in his heart. He is to recite in his heart these blessings that follow a meal. He is not to recite those blessings that precede the meal.
Okay, so does that prove it's rabbinic or biblical?
I don't know.
It would be biblical, wouldn't it?
I'm not sure who said that.
It was
Moshe.
Moshe, okay, so you're also voting biblical from the Mishnah. You think, I don't understand the proof. I really don't. But, okay, someone else, I saw someone raise their hand. and
If
now
you have
I
a
can't see
request, if it's like a request, it would be a special request. It would be biblical, wouldn't it? Derisa. So it's sort of like a special request to Hashem.
I'm not
It's in
sure
your
I
heart.
understand that, but okay. Anyone else want to prove from the Mishnah it's either biblical or rabbinic, the Hamotzi bracha? Ezra.
Since it talks about Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, just like the Birkat Hamazon basically talks about, connects it to the land, and that's biblical. I would assume that based on the wording, it would also be biblical.
Well, it does
So
have
you're
a-
not proving it from the Mishnah, you're using the words of the Hamotzi to imply that it's biblical? You're not connecting that to the Mishnah, are you?
Yes, and
No.
the fact that the Mishnah basically says you shouldn't say it
Mhm.
is indirectly pointing to the fact that it's biblical.
Well,
Uh-huh.
the annotation for line 40 says the recital of Birchat HaMitzon is biblically mandated.
No, we're talking about Hamotzi, not Hamazon, Birchat Hamazon.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Okay, so we got a lot of people thinking that it's biblical, and I must say, I'm not sure I understand any of your reasons how you could prove it from the Mishnah, but let me give you a little hint over here, and that is that the Mishnah talks about a Baal Keri, and it mentions that there are some mitzvahs that he's supposed to think in his mind, some prayers he's supposed to think in his mind, and some prayers that he's not supposed to even think in his mind. Which ones does he think in his mind? Shema and grace after meal. Which one doesn't he even think in his mind? Hamotzi, the blessings of Kriya Shema, all the other blessings he does not even think in his mind. So whatever Shema and what's the reason that Shema in grace after meals he does think in his mind? And once you figure that out, you'll be able to say, well, Hamotzi is the opposite. Because Hamotzi, you don't even think in your mind. So if the Mishnah is telling you that Shema in grace after meals you think in your mind, person who's a Baal Keri, he's supposed to think those in his mind. And all the other brachas, including Hamotzi and the blessings on Shema, he's not supposed to think in his mind. So what we need to figure out is why some does he think in his mind, and why some not. We know he doesn't pray, he doesn't say the prayers, he doesn't have them think them in his mind. in the Mishnah, in the Gemara we learned before, spoke about the difference. And we came to the conclusion, what was the difference? Does anyone remember why prayer you don't do, but Shema and grace after meal you do? Anyone remember what the difference was, Ben? Do you know? Why was grace after meal?
I think the tefillah is not biblical.
Okay.
So you don't have to leharher, I think.
Okay.
Shema,
Tefillah is rabbinic.
maybe it's opposite, I'm not sure. But
Let's go with that. Tefillah is rabbinic. And
Here Shema is
Shema
Derisa.
and grace after meals is biblical. Okay, that's a good point.
Right.
So now we understand the Mishnah a little. The Mishnah gives some cases you think in your mind. In some cases, about Kerry doesn't even think in his mind. And what is the difference? The biblical ones you do think in your mind, and the rabbinic ones you're not even supposed to think in your mind. Right? That was the conclusion that we understood. Now let's take that to all the cases of the Mishnah. Whenever the Mishnah says you should think it in your mind, that means biblical. It's biblical. Whenever the Mishnah says you don't even think it in your mind, that would mean it's rabbinic. So now let's look at the Mishnah. What does the Mishnah say? Do you think hamotzi in your mind or you don't? If you do think it in your mind, that would mean that it's biblical. If you don't think it in your mind, that would mean that it's rabbinic. So let's look at the Mishnah. What does the Mishnah say? Baal Keri, he thinks in his mind the Shema, but he doesn't say the blessing before or after. So that means Shema is biblical, the blessings before and after, rabbinic. Vial HaMazoin, grace after meals, Mevarech liacharav. You do say the grace, you do think it in your mind, the grace after meals. The Einai Mevarech lefanav, but you don't say the Hamotzi. You don't think in your mind the Hamotzi. So what does that mean? That the grace after meals is biblical, you think it in your mind, and the Hamotzi is, you don't think it in your mind. Rabbinic. So that's the proof from the Mishnah. So the Mishnah seems to be pretty clear that it's rabbinic. Now, if it's rabbinic, what did Rabbi Yochanan try to prove here on page 21a? Rabbi Yochanan tries to prove that the Hamotzi bracha is biblical, and he brought a kal v'chaimer. And the Gemara says, big problem. You got yourself into a big problem because the Mishnah, you were trying to build a whole proof that it's biblical, but the Mishnah seems pretty clear that it is rabbinic, because the Mishnah says about Keri doesn't even think that bracha. The Hamotzi, the grace after meals he does. That's biblical. The Hamotzi he doesn't think it. It must be rabbinic. Yes. What did you say, Ben? Ben, did you have a question? Ben?
I wanted to add to it that it says, it says in the Torah, ve'achalta ve'savata.
Okay.
But the bracha on bread is before you savata. It's not from the Torah.
Yeah, but that's not a good proof. You know why? Because Rabbi Yochanan did not say that it's written clearly in the Torah, Hamotzi. Rabbi Yochanan said you can learn it out from a kal v'chaimer. And from a kal v'chaimer, you can make it into a biblical obligation. So that was his reasoning. He was saying, you're right, of course it's not obvious, but I want to prove it I want to use a kal v'chaimer to make it a biblical obligation. And so he wasn't saying it based on a verse. He was telling you, of course, I know that verse, which of course he knew inside out. But what he's saying is based on a kal v'chaimer, you can prove that it would be an obligation biblically to recite it. And on his proof, on his argument of using a kal v'chaimer, the Gemara says it's not that kal v'chaimer is obviously not a valid kal v'chaimer because the Mishnah clearly implies that it's only rabbinic. Okay, so now let's go to the next Gemara, So the Gemara concludes Tiyufta. It was proven wrong. Tiyufta. We've proven that it's these are rabbinic. Before we go to the next Gemara, I will tell you that there is an interesting opinion in the Shulchan Aruch by the Lavush that says that the Torah, why do we recite 3 blessings on the Torah? So he says something very interesting. He says that really the first bracha that you recite on the Torah is a after bracha for yesterday's Torah study. This is a very interesting opinion. It's rare to find such an explanation. This is it's not well known. I'll tell you that. This is the opinion of the Lavush. He says the reason why you have that first bracha, which many people recite, La Soik Divrei Torah or Al Divrei Torah. There are two versions of it. That first bracha is a bracha for yesterday's Torah study, and the next bracha, which is 2 brachas, which are considered one. The next 2 brachas, they're considered one. Those brachas are the bracha before today's Torah study.
Rabbi,
and his explanation is that since when you read the Torah, when you have a regular reading, like in Shul, you have a reading of the Torah, you do recite a bracha beforehand and afterwards. So therefore, they established also the blessing on the Torah. You would recite one before and one after, and it's impossible to recite a bracha after you finish learning, because the whole day you're supposed to learn, and even on your bed you're supposed to think until you fall asleep. So therefore, they established the bracha in the morning for yesterday's Torah study. So that gives you a little inspiration. Next time you recite the first bracha, you could think of this that it's a after bracha for yesterday's learning. In addition, also when you're lying on your bed, you see how important it is that you're really still obligated in studying Torah even when you're on your bed. It's important to think of Torah study even when you're on your bed, and therefore the bracha, the after bracha, according to this view, is not recited then, because you're really supposed to be thinking Torah thoughts on your bed. Okay, yes, Susan.
Rabbi, Torah study and Torah blessings are 2 separate entities?
For sure. You need to recite a bracha before you study Torah. So there's the blessing on the Torah. It's just like before you do any mitzvah. There are different opinions. There are different opinions what the reason of the Berachas HaTorah is. If it's a mitzvah, it's a bracha for a mitzvah. That's one way. Like, for example, before you put a mezuzah on your door, you recite a bracha.
Of course.
Before you shake the lulav, you say a bracha. It's a bracha before a mitzvah. That's one opinion. So that would be a reason to recite the bracha before you study Torah. Another explanation is that the Torah it's a berachas hanenin. You're enjoying. It's a blessing for enjoyment, just like you recite a bracha before you eat food. Here you have a bracha.
We're not supposed to enjoy studying Torah too much, you were saying before.
I said there's 2 views. The common view is that you are supposed to enjoy. Torah study is meant to enjoy. That is the common view, the common understanding. But I did mention there is another view as well, that and it's sort of hinted to in the Gemara. But the common view is that Torah is supposed to be enjoyable. Mesamche leiv, Pekudei Hashem Yesharim, the teachings of Hashem, are Yesharim, are righteous. Mesamche leiv, they bring joy to one's heart. So there are sources as well that you're supposed to enjoy, and that's the common understanding that Torah we're supposed to enjoy when we study. But there is such a view based on the Reishis Chachma, a very Kabbalistic book that maybe I don't know, maybe on certain people are on a high level.
Not to be too exuberant, not to be.
No. Don't worry. You enjoy. Don't worry. Okay. You enjoy. Don't limit yourself. It's
because
fine.
I always end up crying, at least at one part of when we're talking about. I always end up not crying, but joyful crying.
It's okay. It's good. At this point, it's good. When you reach the other level, we'll tell you.
Okay. Thank you.
And And so that would be if it's if it's considered a blessing like of enjoyment. Then there's an option that it's a berachas hoidah, blessing of praise. So just like we praise Hashem, we recite a bracha for thunder and lightning. These are blessings of praise of Hashem. So we recite a bracha on the Torah, praising Hashem for the Torah. So however you look at it, it's a bracha that the bracha is generally recited. Actually, no, if it's a bracha on praise, I guess you normally recite the bracha after you have that praise, after you hear that praise. I have to look into that. But generally, brachas are recited before. Oiver la'asiyas, and brachas are supposed to be recited before the action is done. And so the blessing on the Torah, logically, it's before the Torah study. This is a very unique opinion that says that the first bracha is really for yesterday's Torah study. That's a very unique, very surprising
odd
view, different view. Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay, Ezra. You're muted. Ezra, we cannot hear you.
All right. Which are the three brachot that you're talking about? The one that says,
well, some say Lasa Divrei Torah or Al Divrei Torah.
Yeah.
And then the second bracha is Hamlamed Torah Lama Yisrael.
Okay.
And then the third bracha is Asher Bachar Banu.
Right. And then after that, the Sephardim normally have the Birkat Kohanim. We normally say Birkat Kohanim.
Yeah, but that's not an actual Baruch Atah Hashem blessing. I'm talking about the
it's a connection to the last bracha. You say it right after because it's exactly the same thing that you would normally say if you were so it's as if you're saying it right before you go up to the Sefer Torah. So you would normally say words that come from the Torah, and the one that is given here is the Birkat Kohanim. Right, but if you want to talk about the blessings that are called Berachos HaTorah, the blessings that are on the Torah, you generally refer to those first three, and that the Berachos Kohanim that you recite afterwards is part of the fulfillment of the studying the Torah that you're doing afterwards. It's not one of the brachas of the Torah. No, what I'm saying is that the connection there is that you're saying words. Yeah, it's connected. You're right. It is connected. But I still wouldn't say there's four brachas. I would not use the term. I never said there was four. Yeah. All I said was that you normally say this as a way of showing that you're learning. You're learning words of Torah. Studying Torah right afterwards, because right after you say the bracha, you do the mitzvah. Right. Good point. Ezra mentioned. So the first bracha, you're saying that there's one opinion that's on the previous day's worth. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, David.
Yeah, I was learning in Rambam yesterday from a parak a day, a chapter a day, and I thought it was talking about mitzvahs from the Torah and mitzvahs from the rabbis, and it says that sometimes mitzvahs from the rabbis take precedence; they supersede mitzvah from the Torah. Mm-hmm. And it gave an example. For an instance, if a person takes a vow, he's going to fast every Sunday for the rest of his life. And Sunday, it falls out, it's Yontif. So he's not allowed to fast. He's obligated to eat. He's obligated to fast because the eating on Yontif, celebrating on Yontif, is from the Torah, and the vow is from the Torah. So he's taking a vow to not eat on Yontif, so his vow is superseded by the celebrations of the day. His vow doesn't count, even though it's from the Torah. But the prohibition against fasting fasting on them is based on rabbinic. But if you have a situation where, even though with Yontif you are not allowed to eat, because you have to fast. But for Purim and Hanukkah, his vow is superseded by the celebration of these days. So, in other words, his vow to not eat on Yontif is he's not allowed to eat on Yontif because he made his vow. But if he makes a vow not to eat on Sunday, and Sunday's Hanukkah or Purim, then he has to eat on these days of Hanukkah and Purim, even though they're rabbinic, because they said that the sages sometimes gave their decrees greater power than Torah law, because they were afraid that the Torah law would be just cut short. People would take it lightly. And therefore, if a person could make a vow and override a rabbinic decree, there'd be no point in making decrees. A person could take a vow and say, I take a vow to eat, to drink non-Jewish wine. So he could nullify all these rabbinic decrees by taking a vow. So sometimes the rabbinic law can sometimes supersede a Torah law.
Right. Very, very interesting. Where did, yeah, very, very, very nice.
Yeah, I think it was in
chapter 9. Rambam. No, I'm saying is that the Radvaz mentioned. Yeah, okay, fine. It's a very, very nice. The explanation you gave was very nice at the end with the making of vow.
That was the Radvaz.
Radvaz, right? So so very nice. Now, why are you mentioning that here?
Because we're talking about how Torah, these commandments were from the Torah, and these commandments were from the Rabbanan, and we're making it sound like the Rabbanans, the rabbis' decrees were, generally speaking, not as strong as the Torah decrees. They're like on a lesser level, so that a person might take them so lightly that he might not do them at all. So sometimes the rabbis had to have a situation where the rabbi's decree was stronger than the Torah obligation.
Rabbi?
Very nice. Okay. Very good.
Rabbi,
good point. Yes.
What about Hatarat Nedarim? I mean,
It's okay. I don't mind.
If an individual, Hatarat Nedarim, I mean, here he was making a vow. When he says Hatarat Nedarim, he normally removes that aspect of things.
So what are you saying? You could have done
Hatarat Nedarim. He mate a vow, but when you make Hatarat Nedarim, you're basically nullifying all the vows that you made before in front of a Beit Din, and so therefore that should be able to allow him to eat during holidays.
Oh, you're saying when he recites the Hataras Nedarim, the pre-year, the one he recites that anything I vow in the future should be null and void from that automatically. So any vow that he makes afterwards would be automatically null and void. That's what you're asking.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, good question. So yeah, so this would be in a case where he didn't nullify it. Or in a case where he remembered it. There are different opinions. If he remembers it and still makes it, then that nullification that he recited earlier doesn't take effect, because what he's basically saying is I'm not taking advantage of the fact that I'm disregarding the nullification of before. So there are examples where a person overrides that nullification, and so that's it's also discussed in the commentaries of the Rambam, and I believe the Rambam himself mentions it, because there is he talks about the remembering it in chapter 2 in the laws of Nedarim. He talks about it if you remembered it, and that there are opinions. He brings Yesh Shemayra Lahachmir. Some are machmir. There are different opinions about remembering that. If you remember it when you recite the vow, then does that mean that you're nullifying your annulment, or does that mean that you want it to take effect? Anyway, there's you can check it out in Maimonides, the Laws of Nedarim, chapter 2. Okay. Yes, Edith.
Rabbi?
Edith?
Rabbi, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yes, regarding the grace after meals. Suppose you make a bracha on the food, and then the food is just awful. It was burnt. There was too much pepper in it. You got sick from it. Do you still say, because the grace after meals is really saying thank you. So do you still say that?
So the
Or
grace after
what
meals on the
happens?
bread.
What do you do or not?
So this is the thing. The grace after meals is on
the bread.
is on the bread, really. So all the other food that they burned, you know, and I guess it depends if it's you know, how edible it is. There's edible and there's, you know, there's different levels of edible. You know, if you didn't eat it, then of course you can't recite a grace after meal, because you have to have a certain measurement in order to recite grace, at least an olive size. And if you drink a little milk and you see it spoiled, you spit it out. You don't you don't recite an after bracha, right? But then there's a difference if you like certain things they're not really so good, like wine. It doesn't spoil in one day. Wine, it starts the flavor is a little off, you know, but it's not totally spoiled. So that would be something that you would even make a hagafen on in the first place. You could even make kiddush on, because it doesn't smell like vinegar yet, and it's not spoiled. It's not really a great wine. I wouldn't preferably make kiddush on it in the first place, because it's you know, it's not the perfect. You want to honor Hashem with a nice wine, but it would be it would still be hagafen. But then there's things that are dangerous and things that are inedible. That's another story. Some people like burnt toast, you know, so I wouldn't say it's inedible. You know, they love to burn the toast. And they scrape off a little of the black part. They scrape off, but they like the almost black. They love that, and that would be that you make a double grace after meal for that, because that's like that's a delicacy, you know. So so I'm just saying, like, but anyway, when it comes to grace after meals, it has nothing to do with the food. It has to do with the bread. So therefore, grace after meal, the question normally wouldn't apply unless the bread is moldy or something. But if you benefited from it, you can, you would, as far as I understand, let's say you tasted after you already ate a nice a roll, and afterwards you tasted that some of it must have been mold. It must have been there's a little mold in it. But the fact is, first of all, you probably ate an olive size that's not moldy, and second of all, the fact is you benefited from the bread, because now you're satisfied. So I don't think there would be any question. Of course, you would need to recite the grace after meal. Okay, let's just do one little piece. I know it's just 11 o'clock. Let's just do the first line of the next Gemara. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, or next first few lines. Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, Safek kara kriya Shema. If a person is not sure if they recited Shema, Safek loy kara, they're not sure if they didn't say it. Einay chayzer v'kayrei. They don't go back and recite it. You don't have to go back and recite it. This is not the halacha. This is a Gemara. Do not take this for halacha. So tomorrow morning, if you are not sure if you said Shema, you should repeat it. The Gemara here says don't repeat it, but I'm telling you that the halacha is you should repeat it. And this is what we're learning here is the Gemara. The Gemara, there's an opinion in the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, that Rabbi Yehuda says, and actually on the side it says, in the name of Shmuel, that if you're not sure if you said Shema or not, do not, you don't have to go and repeat it. Safek im Amar emes v'yatziv, if you're not sure if you recited the blessing after the Shema. Safek lo Amar, you're not sure if you didn't say it, you're not sure you said it or not. Chayzer v'yomer, you do go back and recite the emes v'yatziv. The Gemara says, my taima, what is the reason? And the Gemara answers, Kriya Shema d'Rabbanan, emes v'yatziv d'Oraisa. Kriya Shema is rabbinic, emes v'yatziv is biblical. So here we have this new view. This is an opinion that's not the accepted view, that Shema is only rabbinic. I mentioned this to you a few days ago, that there is such a view, that Shema is rabbinic. It's not the accepted view. And it is surprising to say such a thing, that Shema would be rabbinic, but that's what he says. And he says the blessing after the Shema is biblical. And what he means is the blessing after the Shema has Yitzias Mitzrayim. It talks about the Exodus, the mentioning of the Exodus from Egypt, and that is a biblical obligation, and therefore that would be biblical. But the Shema is rabbinic, according to this view of Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel. That means Shmuel. This is Shmuel's view. Okay, we're going to stop here. And David, you wanted to tell me a little about